Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into one of history's coldest professions, being a healer in a medieval castle, where the stone walls themselves seem designed to steal your warmth. Picture this: you've spent all day treating frostbitten servants, brewing warming potions and stitching up injuries from the icy courtyard, and now you're facing the part of your job nobody talks about: surviving the night without freezing to death in your own bed. The irony. You're the person everyone else comes to when they're dying of cold, yet you're fighting the same battle every single night in a fortress that's basically a giant refrigerator made of rock. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. I'm curious how many of you are cozy in climate-controlled rooms while learning about people who would have considered your thermostat an actual miracle. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're standing in the great hall of a castle somewhere in England, let's say, around 1380, and you're the resident healer. Congratulations, you have one of the most respected positions a commoner can hold in this frozen stone maze. But here's what the histories don't tell you: your medical knowledge means absolutely nothing when it comes to the fundamental challenge of your existence, which is not dying in your sleep when the temperature inside the castle drops to barely above freezing. We're talking about indoor temperatures hovering around 35 to 40 degrees Fahrenheit on a typical winter night. Not outside, inside, in the place where you're supposed to rest and recover from your day. The castle you're living in wasn't built for comfort, it was built to keep enemies out and to project power. Those massive stone walls, 3 feet thick in some places, are incredible at stopping arrows and siege weapons. They're also incredible thermal conductors, which is a fancy way of saying they suck the heat right out of the air and radiate cold like they're being paid to do it. During the day, if you're lucky, the Great Hall might have a roaring fire that takes the edge off, but at night that fire dies down to embers because nobody's going to waste precious firewood while everyone's asleep. The cold seeps in through every crack, every window, covered with oiled cloth instead of glass every gap in the floorboards. You're not sleeping in the Great Hall, though that's for the Lord and his family, and maybe a few high-ranking guests on special occasions. You're a healer, which means you've got your own space, probably a small chamber attached to the infirmary, or near the herb storage room. This sounds like a privilege until you realize that your private chamber is basically a stone box with a wooden door that doesn't quite fit its frame. The walls sweat with condensation when the temperature fluctuates. Sometimes you wake up to find actual frost patterns on the inside of your walls, delicate and beautiful, and absolutely terrifying because that frost is forming from the moisture in the air you're breathing. Here's the thing that makes your situation uniquely challenging. Unlike the soldiers who can huddle together in the barracks, or the servants who pile into shared sleeping spaces where body heat multiplies, you need some degree of separation. You're storing medicines, some of which are toxic, some of which are valuable, all of which need to be kept away from curious hands or desperate thieves. You can't just bunk up with 5 other people. Your profession demands a certain amount of privacy and security, which means you're often facing the cold more alone than almost anyone else in the castle. The medical text you've studied, the ones copied from Arabic sources or passed down from monastery scriptoriums, they talk about the importance of warmth for healing. The theory of the 4 humours, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, black bile, requires balance, and cold throws everything into chaos. Cold makes the phlegm rise, causes the blood to thicken, leads to all sorts of imbalances that cause disease. You know this. You preach this to your patients. Stay warm, you tell them. Keep the cold at bay. And then you go back to your own chamber where your breath creates clouds in the air and you can feel the cold radiating up from the stone floor through whatever pathetic barrier you've managed to place between you and it. Historians still argue whether medieval people actually felt the cold differently than we do, whether constant exposure made them more resilient, or whether they simply had no choice but to endure what would hospitalize a modern person within hours. The truth is probably somewhere in the middle. Yes, your body adapts to chronic cold exposure to some degree, but no, that doesn't mean you're comfortable. It doesn't mean you don't lie awake shivering, wondering if this is the night your body finally gives up. The castle architecture works against you in ways that wouldn't be understood for centuries. Heat rises, which means the upper chambers where you might be located, if you're lucky, are slightly warmer than the ground floor. But they're also more exposed to wind. The lower chambers are protected from wind but sit directly on or near the ground, which in winter becomes a massive cold sink. Either way you lose. There's no winning position in a medieval castle when it comes to thermal comfort. There's only degrees of losing. You've probably walked past the chapel on your way to bed, seen the priest or monks at their night prayers. They're enduring the same cold, maybe worse, and they consider it a form of devotion. Suffering brings them closer to understanding Christ's suffering. That's beautiful in a spiritual sense, but you're a healer, and you know what cold actually does to the human body. It's not metaphorical, it's not character building, it's tissue damage, it's cardiac stress, it's immune system suppression. Every night you survive is a medical miracle you're performing on yourself. Your chamber, and let's be generous, calling it that, is wedged into whatever space the castle's architect deemed least useful for anything else. If you're serving a wealthy lord with a proper infirmary, you might have a room directly adjacent to where the sick are kept. This sounds convenient until you realize you're sleeping 10 feet away from people with fevers, chills, coughing fits, and occasionally delirium. The stone wall between you and them does absolutely nothing to muffle sound, and it certainly doesn't stop the cold that circulates through both spaces with democratic cruelty. More commonly, you're tucked somewhere near the herb storage because your lord figures you need access to your supplies at all hours. This actually isn't the worst arrangement. Those dried bundles of thyme, rosemary, sage, and other medicinal plants hanging from the rafters provide something between insulation and psychological comfort. The room smells less like medieval castle funk and more like a peculiar pharmacy. Some of those herbs are slightly hygroscopic, meaning they absorb moisture from the air, which ironically might keep your chamber marginally less damp than other spaces. Medieval people didn't understand the science, but they noticed that herb rooms felt different, and that difference mattered when you're trying to sleep at near-freezing temperatures. The dimensions of your space would make a modern college dorm room look palatial. We're talking maybe 8 feet by 10 feet if you're fortunate, sometimes as small as 6 by 8. The ceiling is low, maybe 7 feet at the highest point, because nobody wasted interior volume on heating efficiency they didn't understand. Lower ceilings mean less air to warm, which actually works in your favour, though you didn't consciously choose this room for that reason. Your ancestors simply built this way, and the accumulated wisdom of generations said that small, low spaces felt warmer, even if nobody could explain why. The floor is either stone laid directly on earth, or wooden planks over stone depending on which level of the castle you occupy. If it's stone, you're dealing with thermal mass that sucks heat from your body all night long, unless you create serious barriers. Think of stone as a battery, except instead of storing electricity, it stores cold, and it releases that cold slowly and steadily into your flesh through any point of contact. If you've got wooden flooring, congratulations. You've got slightly better insulation, but also gaps between boards where drafts shoot through like tiny frozen arrows aimed at your ankles. Your door is wooden, probably oak heavy enough to provide some security, but fitted into the stone door frame with medieval precision. which is to say not very precisely at all. There's a gap at the bottom, wide enough to slide a coin under, and when the wind picks up in the corridors outside, you can literally watch your candle flame dance in response to the draft. Some healers stuff rags or old straw into these gaps. You've probably done this yourself, packing fabric into the crack between door and stone, knowing it'll be kicked loose within a few days, but desperate for any barrier against the moving air that makes everything so much worse. The window situation is almost comedic if it weren't so miserable. If you have a window at all, and many interior chambers don't, it's small, maybe 18 inches square, and it's covered with oiled linen or parchment that's been treated to be translucent. Glass windows exist in 1380, but they're for churches and the very wealthy. You're not getting glass. The oiled cloth lets in a pale, ghostly light during the day and provides essentially zero insulation at night. When wind hits it directly, the fabric bellows inward like it's breathing, and the temperature in your room drops noticeably. You've probably reinforced yours with wooden shutters that close from the inside, but closing them completely means sleeping in absolute darkness, and keeping them open means inviting the full force of winter inside. Historians still argue whether these window coverings were changed seasonally or left up year-round, slowly degrading until they needed replacement. Practical evidence suggests that most were installed once and ignored until they failed completely, which means by midwinter yours is probably torn, stiffened by cold, and about as effective as thoughts and prayers against the wind. Here's a detail that doesn't make it into the romantic castle tales condensation. Your chamber, like every other space in the castle, experiences dramatic temperature fluctuations. During the day, if there's any sun at all, or if you've had a brazier burning, the temperature might climb to 50 degrees. At night, it plummets. This constant cycling means moisture in the air from your breath, from dampness in the stone walls, from the general humidity of medieval England condenses on every cold surface. You wake up to find the stone walls slick with water. In deep winter, that water freezes into patterns that would be Instagram-worthy if Instagram existed, and if you weren't terrified by the implications of ice forming inside your bedroom. The ceiling above you is either the underside of the floor above, or if you're on the top level, the underside of the roof itself. If it's another floor, you can hear everything happening up there. Footsteps, furniture, moving occasionally, things that make you wonder what exactly people do at night. If it's directly under the roof, you've got different problems. Medieval roofs leak. Not might leak, they leak. Rain finds its way through gaps in the slate, or thatch runs along wooden beams and drips into spaces below. Your ceiling might have water stains that darken with every storm, and in winter you might have icicles forming on the beams above your head. Inside, the building. Your furniture consists of whatever you've managed to accumulate or what came with the position. A wooden frame bed, if you're lucky, we'll talk about what's on that frame shortly. A chest for your belongings, which doubles as a seat. Maybe a small table where you prepare medicines or study texts by candlelight. A stool. Everything is wood, everything is functional, and nothing is designed with comfort in mind. The wood itself is cold to the touch half the year. You learn not to rest your bare hand on any surface without expecting that little shock of cold that runs up your arm. The walls are bare stone, maybe with some lime plaster in wealthier establishments, but don't imagine smooth surfaces. Medieval masonry is rough, uneven, and the stones radiate cold like they've got a personal vendetta against warm-blooded creatures. Some healers hang fabric on the walls, old blankets, worn-out clothing, anything to create an air gap between themselves and the stone. This actually helps more than you'd think, not because fabric is warm, but because that trapped air provides a tiny buffer of insulation. Medieval people figured this out through trial and error. The same way they figured out most things do whatever makes you slightly less miserable and keep doing it. Now, we get to the part where you transform yourself from a human being into something resembling a mobile textile pile, because the single most important survival technology available to you is layers. Not fire is temporary and dangerous and goes out. Not architecture, you've already seen how well that's working. Layers. Specifically wool linen, and if you're fortunate or well positioned, some fur. The medieval approach to not freezing to death is essentially to become your own insulation system, and you start building that system the moment the sun goes down. You don't undress for bed the way modern people do. That's the first thing to understand. The romantic notion of slipping into some comfortable nightgown and tucking yourself into fresh sheets is pure fantasy. What you're actually doing is a careful calculation of which layers you can afford to keep on, without cutting off circulation, balanced against which layers you absolutely cannot remove without risking hypothermia. It's a nightly negotiation between comfort and survival survival usually wins. Your base layer is the chemise, a long linen shirt that goes all the way down to your knees or even ankles. You've been wearing this all day under your other clothes and you're keeping it on all night. Linen is interesting stuff. It wicks moisture away from your skin, which matters more than you might think because dampness is your enemy. A sweaty chemise will suck the heat right out of your body, so the fact that linen breathes and dries relatively quickly makes it the medieval world's high-tech base layer. Yours is probably stained, probably off-white rather than actually white, and definitely not fresh. You might change it once a week if you're fastidious, once a month if you're normal, or basically never if you're too exhausted or too cold to deal with being naked, even for the 30 seconds it takes to swap shirts. Over the chemise, you're likely keeping on at least one wool undertunic. Wool is the miracle fabric of the medieval world, and there's a reason every sheep in England is more valuable than most of the people. Wool insulates even when it's wet, which is good because everything is at least slightly damp all the time. It traps air in its fibres, and that trapped air is what actually keeps you warm. Your wool tunic is probably undyed or dyed some muddy colour with local plants, and it's scratchy against your skin wherever it makes direct contact, which is why you've got that linen chemise underneath acting as a buffer. On particularly brutal nights, the ones where you can see your breath in thick clouds, even with the door shut and a candle burning, you're adding a second wool tunic over the first. This isn't about fashion or propriety. It's about creating multiple air pockets between layers. Medieval people didn't understand the thermodynamics, but they absolutely understood through bitter experience that two thinner layers worked better than one thick one. The air trapped between the layers acts as insulation, and the more interfaces you create between the cold and your skin, the better your odds. Your legs get the same treatment. You're wearing wool hose, basically thick socks that go up to your thighs, and you're keeping those on. Your feet are particularly vulnerable because they're the farthest from your core, and because cold rises from the floor all night. Some healers wrap their feet in additional strips of wool, or even stuff their hose with dried grass or straw for extra insulation. This sounds ridiculous until you've experienced the specific agony of feet, so cold they've gone numb, and then the worse agony when they start to warm up and the sensation returns in waves of pins and needles. Historians still argue whether medieval people wore dedicated nightcaps or simply kept on their regular daytime head coverings while sleeping. The evidence suggests both depending on personal preference and how cold it was. What's not in dispute is that you're covering your head. An enormous amount of body heat escapes through your scalp, up to 40% if your head is bare, and while medieval people didn't have the precise percentage, they knew that an uncovered head in winter meant a miserable night. Your head covering might be a simple linen coif tied under your chin, or a wool cap pulled down over your ears, or both. The goal is to keep that heat inside your body instead of radiating it into the frigid air of your chamber. If you're a woman healer, and plenty of you are despite the male-dominated narrative of medieval medicine, you're already wearing your hair in braids wrapped close to your head, probably covered with a wimple or veil during the day. At night, you're keeping those braids and adding more coverage. Hair itself provides some insulation, but loose hair also creates cold spots where air can circulate against your scalp. The solution is to contain everything under fabric and hope for the best. Now here's where status starts to matter. If you're serving a wealthy household and you've earned your lord's favour, maybe you saved his child from a fever, maybe you successfully treated his wife's difficult childbirth, you might have access to fur. Not a full fur coat that's for nobility, but perhaps a fur-lined hood or a rabbit skin vest that goes under your outer layers. Fur is extraordinarily effective insulation because you're essentially wearing an animal's own cold weather survival system. The guard hairs shed moisture, the underfur traps air, and suddenly you've got a legitimate barrier against the cold instead of just layers of fabric that slow down your heat loss. Most healers don't have fur. What you have instead is wool, more wool, and strategic layering of wool. You might have a heavy outer robe, the kind you wear during the day when you're moving around the castle, and on the coldest nights you're sleeping in that too. It's heavy, it's restrictive, and it makes rolling over in bed a project that requires planning and effort. But it also means you're wrapped in 5 or 6 pounds of wool, and that weight itself becomes part of the insulation strategy. Heavy fabrics trap more air, create fewer gaps where heat can escape, and generally turn you into something resembling a human-shaped wool bale. The art is knowing what you can get away with removing. Your outer shoes or boots, those come off because sleeping in hard leather is miserable and actually counterproductive. Leather doesn't breathe, so your feet will sweat, and then that moisture will make you colder. But soft cloth shoes or just your wool hose, those stay on. Any belts or ties that actually constrict those need loosening because you need blood flow to your extremities, and a tight belt around your middle is working against you. But the layers themselves, they're your survival system, and you're wearing them until spring. Let's talk about what you're actually lying on, because this is where the medieval sleeping experience gets truly medieval. Your mattress, and we're using that term generously, is essentially a large fabric sack stuffed with straw rushes, or if you've really made something of yourself, a mixture that includes some wool scraps or even feathers. The wealthy get feather beds, you as a castle healer get straw, and you should consider yourself fortunate because at least you're not sleeping directly on a wooden plank or the stone floor like the lowest servants. The straw inside your mattress is probably rye straw or wheat straw, left over from the harvest and considered worthless for anything except padding and animal bedding. When it's fresh, which is to say, when you first stuff your mattress at the beginning of autumn, it has a sweet, almost pleasant smell, and it provides decent cushioning between your body and the wooden bed frame or rope lattice you're lying on. The problem is that straw breaks down. Every time you lie on it, every time you shift position during the night, you're crushing those hollow stems, turning them from springy tubes into compressed fragments. By midwinter, your mattress has lost maybe half its volume, and you're essentially sleeping on a lumpy fabric bag containing what amounts to sharp broken plant material. The straw also absorbs moisture from your body, from the general dampness of the castle, from the condensation that forms overnight. Damp straw doesn't insulate, it actually conducts cold rather efficiently, which means the very thing that's supposed to provide a barrier between you and the cold, wooden frame, is becoming a cold conducting layer. You know this because you can feel it. The middle of your mattress where you sleep every night is compressed and damp and cold. The edges, which you rarely use, are still somewhat fluffy and dry. Some nights you try sleeping at a diagonal just to find a better spot, but you always end up back in your body-shaped depression, because that's where your exhausted body naturally settles. Now let's talk about the inhabitants. Your straw mattress is an ecosystem and you're not its only resident. There are fleas guaranteed. Fleas love straw, they love the warmth of your body, and they love that you're essentially providing them with an all-night buffet. You've been bitten so many times that you barely notice the itching anymore unless it's particularly bad. Lice are also present both in your bedding and in your clothing and hair. Medieval people aren't dirty by choice. They're dealing with a technology level that makes cleanliness extraordinarily difficult, and parasites are simply part of life. You might strip and check your chemise for lice during the day, crushing them between your thumbnails when you find them, but you're never getting rid of them entirely. There might be mice. Small ones attracted by the straw and the warmth, and occasionally by food scraps if you've been eating in your chamber. They rustle through the mattress at night, and you've learned to mostly ignore them unless they're directly crawling on you, which happens more often than you'd like. Some healers keep cats for exactly this reason. The cat sleeps on or near the bed, and its presence keeps the mouse population somewhat manageable. Plus the cat is warm, which we'll get back to later. Bedbugs are another distinct possibility, though historians still argue about how widespread they were in medieval England versus other parts of Europe. If you have them, you know it. They bite in clusters, usually where your skin presses against the mattress, and the bites itch ferociously. Some medical texts of the period recommend various herbal treatments to repel bedbugs, pennyroyal, wormwood, tansy. Whether these work is debatable, but the act of refreshing your mattress with strongly scented herbs at least makes you feel like you're fighting back. The wooden bed frame itself is simple, 4 posts with side rails, and either a solid wooden platform or more commonly a lattice of rope stretched across the frame. The ropes are threaded through holes in the rails and pulled tight, creating a somewhat flexible sleeping surface. Except the ropes stretch over time, especially in damp conditions, which means your sleeping surface sags. That's where the expression sleep tight comes from. Periodically, someone needs to tighten those ropes, or you'll be sleeping in a hammock-like depression. As a healer, you're probably doing this maintenance yourself every few weeks, using a wooden tool to lever the ropes tighter and restore some semblance of a flat surface. Under the straw mattress, some people use an additional layer of rushes or a thin wool pad, anything to create more distance between themselves and the rope lattice or wooden boards. This helps marginally with both comfort and insulation. The key principle is creating layers of trapped air. Straw itself isn't particularly insulating, it's the air spaces between the stems that matter. Compressed damp straw has no air spaces, which is why, by February, your mattress has become nearly useless at its primary job of keeping you off the cold frame. If you're in a monastery infirmary rather than a castle, you might have access to a slightly better mattress. Monks sometimes pooled resources for the infirmary, since caring for the sick was considered a holy duty. But even in monasteries, the mattresses are fundamentally the same technology fabric bags of organic matter, slowly decomposing under your body weight. The difference is maybe more frequent changing of the straw, better quality fabric for the ticking, and perhaps some aromatic herbs mixed into the stuffing that make the experience slightly less like sleeping on a compost heap. Changing your mattress straw is a major operation that most people do once or twice a year. If they're diligent, once a year. If they're normal, or basically never. If they're too busy, too tired, or too cold to face the task. You have to empty the old straw, which by now is broken, damp, probably mouldy, and definitely hosting a small civilization of parasites. Then you need fresh straw, which means either raiding the stables during harvest season or saving your own supply. You refill the ticking so it's shut, and for about 2 weeks you have a relatively comfortable sleeping surface. Then the compression begins again, and by midwinter you're back to sleeping on barely padded wood. Some healers give up on the straw entirely and just pile wool blankets on the wooden frame or ropes, creating layers they can adjust and rearrange. This has advantages. Wool stays somewhat insulating, even when damp, and you can add or remove layers depending on the temperature. The disadvantage is that you're sleeping on a much harder surface, and after a long day on your feet preparing medicines and treating patients, your hips and shoulders will definitely register complaints. The pillow situation is similarly grim. A fabric bag filled with straw or chaff, maybe with some wool or feathers if you're lucky. It goes flat within weeks and you're basically resting your head on a lumpy sack of plant fragments. Some people forgo pillows entirely and just fold up a spare cloak or blanket to put under their heads. The goal isn't comfort in any modern sense, it's keeping your neck and head slightly elevated so that the cold air pooling at mattress level isn't being breathed directly into your lungs all night. Now we arrive at the critical question: how much fabric does it actually take to not die in your sleep when the temperature in your stone box drops to freezing? The answer is more than you think, and then more than that. Medieval people understood through generations of trial and fatal error that blankets weren't a comfort, they were survival equipment, and you needed a weight of them that would seem almost oppressive to modern sensibilities. Your first layer over your clothed body is probably a linen sheet if you have one. This seems counterintuitive because linen is light and breathable, the opposite of what you'd think you need. But that linen sheet serves a crucial purpose. It protects your wool blankets from the oil, sweat, and general grime of your body. Wool is difficult to wash. It requires hot water, labour and time, and washing it too often causes it to felt and lose its insulating properties. The linen sheet, on the other hand, can be washed more easily and more frequently. It's a barrier layer that keeps your expensive wool blankets functional for longer. Some healers skip this entirely because they don't have spare linen, or because they've decided that one more layer of wool matters more than cleanliness. Over the linen, if you have it, comes the first wool blanket. This is probably undyed, or a muddy brown from whatever local plants were used for dye, woven from coarser wool that's sturdy rather than soft. It might be 6 feet by 4 feet, enough to cover most of your body if you're lying straight. Medieval blankets aren't the generous queen-size rectangles we're used to. They're sized for efficiency and cost of materials. You learn to sleep in positions that maximize coverage, often curled somewhat into a fetal position, to keep your extremities under the blanket edge. The second wool blanket goes on top of the first, and this is where you start to feel the weight. 2 layers of heavy wool probably weigh 8 to 10 pounds combined, and that weight itself becomes part of the insulation strategy. The pressure helps eliminate air gaps where heat can escape and cold can infiltrate. It also makes you feel secured, contained, which has psychological benefits when you're trying to sleep while frost forms on your chamber walls. On truly cold nights, the ones where the wind is howling through every crack in the castle, and you can hear ice cracking on the stones, you're adding a third wool blanket. Now you're under 15 pounds of fabric and moving becomes difficult. Rolling over is a project that requires planning. Getting up to use the chamber pot becomes such an ordeal that you think twice about whether you really need to go. But you're also noticeably warmer, or at least less brutally cold, which is the best you can hope for. Some castle healers have access to a 4th layer that's not quite a blanket, a heavy wool coverlet, or even a fur throw if they've really distinguished themselves in service. Fur is the medieval equivalent of high-tech insulation, rabbit, fox, squirrel, or if you've saved someone very important, maybe marten or beaver. The fur goes on top because it sheds moisture and creates an additional air-trapping layer with the guard hairs. A fur throw might only cover your torso and thighs rather than your whole body, But that's fine, you're prioritizing your core temperature. Your hands and feet are going to be cold regardless. Keeping your chest and abdomen warm is what prevents hypothermia. Historians still argue whether people tucked their blankets under the mattress or let them hang loose. The evidence suggests both methods were used depending on personal preference and bed construction. Tucking creates a sealed environment with less air exchange, which keeps heat in but also means you're breathing increasingly stale air all night. Leaving blankets loose means better ventilation but more draft infiltration. Most people probably unconsciously adjusted throughout the night, pulling blankets tighter when they got cold, loosening them if they got too warm though. Too warm is not really a problem you face often in a medieval castle in January. The total weight on your body right now is probably between 15 and 20 pounds of fabric, not counting your own clothing layers. This is the equivalent of a modern weighted blanket, except you didn't choose this weight for its therapeutic anxiety-reducing properties. You chose it because it's literally the difference between sleeping and shivering yourself into exhaustion. That weight restricts movement, makes your breathing slightly more laboured, and creates a sense of being trapped that can be unnerving if you think about it too much. So you don't think about it. You just accept that this is what survival looks like. The blanket math changes based on where you fall in the castle hierarchy. A noble in the Lord's chamber might have 6 or 7 layers, including genuine fur blankets and possibly even a feather-filled coverlet. A servant in the communal sleeping area might have 2 thin blankets shared among 3 people. You as a healer probably fall somewhere in the middle. 3 wool blankets is realistic 4 if you've been there a while, and accumulated extras through various means. Maybe you inherited a blanket from a previous healer who died. Maybe you were given one as payment for treating someone's serious injury. Medieval economies run partially on barter, and high-quality wool fabric is valuable enough to use as currency. Here's something the historical records rarely mention. Blankets don't stay clean. That wool is absorbing your sweat, the moisture from your breath, the general dampness of the air, and it's doing this night after night for months. Wool can absorb up to 30% of its weight in moisture before it feels wet to the touch, which is both good and bad. Good because it means the blanket can absorb a lot of your body's moisture without becoming obviously damp. Bad because it means your blankets are accumulating water weight that makes them heavier and eventually compromises their insulation. You might air your blankets out once every few weeks if the weather permits, hanging them over a rope or fence in whatever weak winter sun manages to appear. This helps dry them and theoretically reduces the flea population, though it doesn't eliminate them. Some healers use aromatic herbs between blanket layers, lavender mint chamomile, which doesn't actually repel insects, but makes the experience of sleeping under increasingly musty wool slightly more bearable. The smell is psychological comfort masquerading as pest control. At night, wrapped in your layers and feeling the weight pressed down on you, you might experience something modern. Sleep science has documented the cocoon effect. The heavy blankets trigger a sense of security that helps you relax despite the cold, despite the discomfort, despite the knowledge that you're sleeping in conditions that would be considered dangerous by any modern standard. Your ancestors developed this technology through countless winters, figuring out through grim experience exactly how many pounds of wool it took to wake up alive in the morning. And now you're benefiting from that accumulated wisdom, even if benefiting means simply not freezing to death. There's one more heat source available to you that's both tempting and terrifying: the brazier. This is essentially a metal bowl on legs filled with burning charcoal that sits somewhere in your chamber, radiating blessed warmth into the frigid air. It sounds perfect. It sounds like the solution to all your problems, It's also a fantastic way to die in your sleep if you're not extremely careful, and as a healer you know this better than most people in the castle. The brazier itself is simple technology iron or bronze bowl-shaped, with 3 or 4 legs to keep it off the floor, and sometimes a perforated lid that's supposed to contain sparks. Charcoal is the fuel of choice because it burns hotter and cleaner than wood with less smoke and flame. You can get a brazier glowing with chunks of charcoal that radiate intense heat, without filling your small chamber with the thick smoke that wood produces. This matters because your chamber is poorly ventilated at best, and you're going to be breathing this air all night. Getting the brazier going is an evening ritual when you decide the cold is worth the risk. You start with embers from the kitchen fire, or the great hall, carrying them carefully in a small metal container, trying not to let them die on the cold walk through the castle corridors. You place these embers in your brazier and add small pieces of charcoal, blowing gently until they catch. Gradually you add larger pieces until you have a bed of glowing coals that radiates heat you can feel from several feet away. For the first time all day your chamber feels almost comfortable, almost warm. You can take off one of your outer layers. You can stop shivering. It's glorious. The heat from a properly loaded brazier is immediate and intense. Stand close and you can feel it on your face like summer sun. The metal bowl itself becomes hot enough to cause serious burns if touched. The air around it shimmers and rises in visible waves. Your frozen stone chamber, which has been steadily draining the life from you all evening, suddenly has a small sun in it. You're warm, actually warm, not just less cold, genuinely warm. This is dangerous because it makes you careless. Here's what you know as a healer, but might forget in your desperate gratitude for warmth-burning charcoal produces carbon monoxide. This colourless, odourless gas displaces oxygen in enclosed spaces and causes death. That's almost gentle. You get drowsy, you fall asleep, and you never wake up. It's killed countless people throughout history, and it's going to keep killing people for centuries until someone invents carbon monoxide detectors. In a large drafty great hall with high ceilings, a brazier is relatively safe because the gas disperses. In your small, tightly sealed chamber, you're gambling with your life. Medieval people understood that enclosed fires could be deadly, even if they didn't understand the mechanism. They called it bad air or corrupt air, and they knew that people sometimes died in sealed rooms with braziers. The solution was ventilation, keeping a window shutter slightly open, or ensuring the door gap was substantial enough to allow air circulation. But here's the problem. Ventilation means letting in the cold, which defeats the entire purpose of having a brazier in the first place. So you make compromises that might kill you. You position the brazier away from anything flammable, no closer than 3 feet to your bed, well clear of any fabric hanging on walls, away from your medical supplies, which might include alcohol-based tinctures. You keep the window shutter cracked open, even though it breaks your heart to let precious heat escape. You promise yourself you'll stay awake to monitor the fire. Make sure it's burning properly, put it out before you sleep. This promise lasts about an hour before your exhaustion overwhelms your caution. The truly paranoid, and as a healer, you might fall into this category, use the brazier for a few hours in the evening to take the worst edge off the cold, then extinguish it completely before sleeping. You do this by cutting off the oxygen supply, spreading sand or ash over the coals, or covering the brazier with its lid if it has one, or simply moving the coals outside your chamber. The residual heat in the metal bowl continues radiating for a while, and your chamber retains some warmth for maybe an hour after the fire is out. Then the cold comes creeping back, but at least you're not playing carbon monoxide roulette. Some castle chambers has better setups, a small fireplace built into the wall, properly vented with a chimney that draws the smoke and bad air up and out. If you're lucky enough to have this, you're in a different risk category entirely. You can keep a small fire going most of the night with much less danger. The problem is that most healers' chambers don't have this luxury, because fireplaces are expensive to build and reserved for more important rooms. You get a brazier or nothing, and most nights you choose nothing because the risk isn't worth it. Historians still argue about how commonly braziers were used in private chambers versus communal areas. The archaeological evidence is limited because metal braziers were valuable and got recycled, melted down for other uses. What we do know from medical texts and legal records is that deaths from bad air in sealed chambers were common enough to be recognized as a specific danger. The fact that people kept using braziers despite this suggests just how desperately cold they were. On the nights when you do risk the brazier, there's a specific kind of sleep you experience. You're warm, genuinely, wonderfully warm, but you're also slightly alert, never falling into the deepest sleep, because some survival instinct keeps part of your brain monitoring for danger. You might wake up several times to check that nothing's caught fire, that you're not feeling dizzy or nauseated from carbon monoxide. This half-vigilant sleep is better than shivering exhaustion, but worse than true rest. You're trading one form of misery for another, and you won't know until morning whether you made the right choice. The charcoal itself is a precious resource. It's made by burning wood in oxygen-limited conditions, a specialized process that not everyone knows how to do properly. The castle might have a dedicated charcoal maker, or you might buy it from traveling merchants who carry it in large sacks. It's expensive relative to simple firewood because of the labor involved in making it. Using a brazier all night every night would bankrupt you or exhaust your allocated supplies. So you ration it, saving it for the nights when you literally cannot get warm any other way, when the cold has penetrated so deep into your bones that you can't stop shaking even under all your blankets. Here's a survival strategy that the historical records reluctantly acknowledge, but that was absolutely central to not freezing to death. You don't sleep alone if you can avoid it. Shared body heat is free, renewable, and doesn't produce carbon monoxide. 2 people under blankets can maintain a temperature differential that would be impossible solo. 3 people, even better. Medieval sleeping arrangements were far more communal than we're comfortable admitting, and this wasn't primarily about intimacy or poverty. It was thermodynamics disguised as social practice. As a healer, your situation is complicated. You're neither nobility nor common servant, which means the usual bed-sharing hierarchies don't clearly apply to you. You can't just crawl into bed with the Lord's family. That would be wildly inappropriate and possibly dangerous. But you're also not expected to pile into the servants' communal sleeping room, where 10 people might share 2 beds in shifts. You occupy this awkward middle ground where you have privacy, which is prestigious, but privacy in winter means you're bearing the full thermal burden alone. The solution many healers arrive at is taking on an apprentice or assistant who sleeps in your chamber. This is defensible from multiple angles. They need to be available for nighttime medical emergencies. They're learning from you through constant proximity, and they need supervision. The fact that they're also a warm body under the blankets is the unspoken benefit that everyone understands, but nobody explicitly mentions. An apprentice might be anywhere from 12 to 20 years old, and they're sleeping either in the same bed as you or on a pallet on the floor nearby. Either way, you're warming a smaller space together. If you're sharing the bed itself, there's a whole protocol about positioning that depends on age, gender, and status. Generally, the senior person, you gets the wall side of the bed, which is both warmer because it's away from the door draft and more secure because nobody can reach you without going through your bed companion first. The apprentice or servant sleeps on the outer edge, which is colder and more exposed, but also easier to exit quickly if there's an emergency. In practice, both of you are so wrapped in blankets and pressed together for warmth that these distinctions matter less than the simple physics of two heat-generating bodies instead of one. The temperature difference is remarkable. A bed occupied by two people might maintain an internal temperature 10 to 15 degrees higher than a solo bed. That's the difference between genuinely dangerous cold and merely miserable cold. Your combined body heat creates a microclimate under the blankets that both of you benefit from. You can actually achieve something resembling comfortable sleep instead of that shivering half-consciousness that leaves you exhausted in the morning. There are obvious complications. Two people generate more moisture through breathing and perspiration, which means your bedding gets damper faster. You have to coordinate blanket adjustments. If one person pulls, the other gets exposed. Someone snores or kicks or has restless sleep, and suddenly you're both awake. There's the intimacy issue, which medieval people handled through a combination of pragmatism and strict social rules about who could share beds with whom. Same-sex bed sharing was completely normal and unremarkable. Mixed-sex bed sharing outside of marriage was technically forbidden, but happened constantly anyway because freezing to death was a more immediate concern than church disapproval. Historians still argue about the precise boundaries of acceptable bed sharing in different social contexts. What's clear from household records, legal documents, and personal accounts is that solitary sleeping was unusual enough to be noteworthy. When someone slept alone, it was often mentioned specifically suggesting that shared sleeping was the default expectation. Travellers staying at inns expected to share beds with strangers. Servants shared beds within their status group. Even among the nobility, children and sometimes adults of the same family shared beds regularly. As a healer, if you don't have an apprentice, you might have other options. A trusted servant assigned to help you might sleep in your chamber. If you're treating a patient who needs overnight monitoring, they're in your space anyway, and their fevered body is actually generating useful heat, assuming their illness isn't something you're worried about catching. Some healers keep a servant child sleeping on a pallet near the door, ostensibly to run errands, but practically to add another warm body to the room's thermal equation. The economics of shared warmth become even more obvious in the servants' quarters, where the bed-sharing situation reaches levels that would horrify modern fire marshals. 3 to a bed is common, 4 is not unusual. The bodies are arranged like spoons, everyone facing the same direction to maximize contact and minimize gaps. The person in the middle is warmest, the people on the edges are coldest, and there's an understanding that positions rotate throughout the night or across nights so everyone gets a turn at the warm spot. This isn't optional efficiency, it's survival math. With only 2 thin blankets for 4 people, the only way everyone survives the night is by becoming a collective heat source. The social dynamics of bed sharing deserve a whole separate discussion. Who you sleep next to matters. There are hierarchies, preferences, and sometimes genuine affection between bed partners who've spent years pressed together through cold nights. There are also tensions, disputes over blanket-hogging accusations of pushing someone toward the cold edge, complaints about snoring or smell. Medieval court records occasionally mention fights that started over sleeping arrangements, which tells you how high the stakes were. A warm sleeping position wasn't trivial. It was a valuable resource worth defending. For you as a healer, the presence of another person in your chamber also serves non-thermal purposes. They're a witness if someone accuses you of improper behavior. They can fetch help if you become ill during the night. They can assist if there's a medical emergency and someone comes pounding on your door at 3 a.m. Medieval life had far less privacy than we're used to, and while that had downsides, it also meant you were rarely facing danger or discomfort completely alone. Some nights, despite having a bed partner, you're still brutally cold. The wind finds every crack in your chamber. The temperature drops so low that even two people under 4 blankets can't achieve real warmth. Those are the nights when you lie there pressed against another human being, both of you shivering, and you wonder if this is sustainable. If you can really do this every winter for the rest of your life. The honest answer is that many people don't winter. Mortality rates tell that story clearly. But tonight you're alive, and the person next to you is alive, and their breath creates small clouds of vapour that mix with yours in the darkness. It's not comfort exactly, but it's something. It's company in the cold. If sharing a bed with another person helps, then why not take it a step further and create an actual fortress around that bed? This is where medieval bed curtains stop being decorative and become essential survival equipment. You've probably seen them in museum displays or period films, heavy fabric panels hanging from a frame around the bed, and thought they looked romantic or luxurious. They're not. They're a desperate attempt to create a microclimate that won't kill you, and they work surprisingly well if you can afford them. The principle is simple: trap your body heat in the smallest possible volume of air. Your chamber might be 35 degrees, but the space inside your curtained bed could be 20 degrees warmer just from your body heat and breath. That enclosed 6 by 7 foot space becomes a survivable environment carved out of the hostile larger room. The curtains aren't about privacy though, they provide that too. They're about not waking up with frost on your blankets. The fabric itself is heavy wool, usually in dark colours because dyes are expensive, and you're not going for aesthetics here. Some wealthier households use tapestry weight fabric with woven patterns, but that's showing off plain wool works just as well. The key is density and weight. Lightweight linen curtains would be useless. You need thick material that blocks drafts and traps heat. Each panel might weigh 10 or 15 pounds and hang from wooden or metal rods mounted to the bed frame or the ceiling beams above. A fully curtained bed has panels on all 4 sides and sometimes across the top as well, creating a fabric room within your stone room. You enter through a gap in the curtains, typically on the side away from the wall, and once you're inside you can pull them closed behind you. The effect is immediate and disorienting if you're not used to it. Suddenly you're in darkness, cut off from whatever dim light your tallow candle was providing, but you're also noticeably warmer. The air feels different, less hostile, more still. Inside your fabric cocoon, the temperature rises from your body heat within about 30 minutes. If there are 2 of you in the bed, it happens faster. The curtains prevent that heat from dissipating into the larger chamber, and they block the drafts that would otherwise flow across your bed all night. You're still cold by modern standards. We're talking maybe 55 degrees inside the curtains when it's 35 outside them, but that 20-degree difference is enormous. It's the difference between fitful, shivering half-sleep and actual restorative rest. The downside is that you're also trapping moisture. Every breath you exhale adds water vapour to the enclosed space. If you're sharing the bed, that's doubled. By morning, the air inside your bed curtains is noticeably humid, and if it's cold enough that moisture condenses on the fabric itself. You might wake up to find the inside surface of your curtains damp with condensation. In extreme cold, that moisture can actually freeze, creating a layer of frost on the interior fabric. You're literally sleeping inside an ice cave made of wool. And the worst part is that this is still better than sleeping without curtains. Historians still argue about how common fully curtained beds were across different social classes. The evidence suggests that nobility almost always had them, well-off merchants, and successful tradespeople often had them, and common people had simpler versions or none at all. As a healer in a castle, you probably fall somewhere in the middle. Maybe you have curtains on 3 sides and use the wall as your 4th side. Maybe you have just 1 or 2 panels that you can reposition to block the worst drafts. Or maybe if you've been there long enough and served well enough, you have a complete set carefully maintained because you know they might save your life. The maintenance of bed curtains is its own project. They accumulate dust, they absorb smoke and cooking smells from the rest of the castle. They develop tears and weak spots from being pulled open and closed hundreds of times. Wool can be brushed and aired, but not easily washed. Getting these heavy panels truly clean would require taking them down, finding enough hot water to submerge them, and having the labour and time to do the washing. Most people never wash their bed curtains. They brush them, occasionally air them in summer if they remember, and hope that the layers of accumulated grime don't become too offensive. The curtains also provide unexpected benefits beyond warmth. They muffle sound, which matters in a castle where stone walls transmit every footstep, every conversation, every midnight crisis. Inside your curtained bed, you're acoustically isolated enough to achieve deeper sleep. They block light, which is useful if someone needs to carry a lantern through the castle at night, or if there's a full moon shining through your inadequate window covering. And yes, they do provide privacy, which matters if you're sharing sleeping quarters with others, or if you simply need a space that feels like it's entirely yours. There's also a psychological dimension that medieval people probably felt but couldn't articulate. Being enclosed in a small dark space triggers something primal. You feel protected, contained safe in a way that an open bed in a drafty chamber can never provide. Modern sleep research talks about the security of enclosed sleeping spaces, how they reduce anxiety and improve sleep quality. You don't know the science, but you know the feeling. When you close those curtains, you're not just keeping out the cold, you're keeping out the night itself, all its dangers and fears and uncertainties. Of course, bed curtains are also a fire hazard. A carelessly placed candle and ember from a brazier, even a particularly vigorous tallow candle, could ignite those heavy unwashed wool panels, and then you're trapped inside a burning fabric cage. Castle fires were common enough to be a constant background worry, and beds were involved in enough of them that there were specific prayers asking for protection from fire during sleep. You're aware of this risk every time you light your candle, every time you consider keeping the brazier burning just a little longer. The wealthy sometimes had bed curtains lined with fur, marten, fox or squirrel skins sewn to the interior side of the wool panels. This is peak luxury, the kind of thing that marks you as genuinely rich, and it's also genuinely functional. The fur adds another insulation layer, traps even more air, and turns your bed into something approaching comfortable. You don't have fur-lined curtains, but sometimes lying in your wool-curtained darkness, listening to the wind howl outside, you imagine what it would be like. To be warm enough that you could actually remove a clothing layer. To sleep without that constant low-grade shivering that you've learned to ignore but never stops. To wake up and not immediately dread leaving the tiny warm space you've carved out of the cold. Let's talk about your head for a moment, because while you've wrapped your body in wool and created your blanket fortress, and possibly even enclosed yourself in curtains, your head remains a critical vulnerability. This isn't just about comfort. It's about basic thermophysiology that medieval people understood through experience even without the science. An uncovered head in a freezing room is like leaving a window open in your insulation system. Heat pours out of your scalp and face all night, and no amount of blankets on your body will compensate for that loss. Your nightcap, and you're definitely wearing one, is probably made of linen or wool depending on what you have available and how cold it is. Linen for milder nights, because it's softer against your skin and doesn't itch. Wool for the brutal nights, because nothing else provides that level of insulation. The cap itself is fitted close to your head, covering your hair completely with ties under your chin to keep it secure. Some versions extend down over your ears, which is crucial, because exposed ears in cold air become painful quickly, and are vulnerable to frostbite if the temperature drops low enough. If you're a woman, you're likely already wearing your hair in tight braids wrapped close to your skull, and the nightcap goes over that. This creates layers hair, then more hair arranged to trap air, then fabric. The effect is like insulation around a pipe, keeping the heat your body generates from escaping through your scalp. If you're a man, your hair is probably shorter by medieval standards, maybe to your shoulders, and the cap is even more critical because you have less natural insulation. Some people sleep with a wool scarf wrapped around their neck and lower face, leaving just their nose and eyes exposed. This looks absurd and feels suffocating at first, but it serves multiple purposes. It keeps your neck warm, obviously, but it also warms the air you're breathing before it enters your lungs. Breathing frigid air all night is hard on your respiratory system. It dries out your airways, triggers coughing, and can contribute to the chest infections that kill so many people during winter. A scarf creates a pocket of warmer, more humid air that you recirculate with each breath. The moisture from your breath condenses on the fabric of your scarf and cap throughout the night. By morning, if it's cold enough, these might be damp or even frozen stiff. You peel them off, and they literally stand up on their own, shaped like your head and neck stiff with ice. This is normal. This is what survival looks like. You hang them somewhere to dry, hopefully near whatever heat source exists in the castle, and you'll put them back on tonight, slightly damp perhaps, but better than nothing. Historians still argue about whether most people slept with their faces partially covered, or whether that was just for the coldest extremes. Personal accounts from the period are frustratingly vague. People mention sleeping in caps, but rarely describe the full setup in detail because it was so mundane to them. What we can infer from medical texts and later documentation is that covering the head during sleep was universal across all social classes. Even the nobility in their relatively warmer chambers wore nightcaps. Even children wore them. To sleep without a head covering in winter was considered dangerous and possibly crazy. Your face itself presents a problem with no good solution. You can't fully cover it because you need to breathe, and a night spent with fabric directly over your nose and mouth would leave you gasping and claustrophobic. But your face is also extremely vulnerable to cold. It's all blood vessels near the surface designed to radiate heat, which is exactly what you don't want. So you compromise. You burrow your face down into your blankets, creating a small opening for air, while covering as much facial area as possible. You breathe into the space between blankets, slowly warming that pocket of air with your exhalations. This means you're breathing increasingly stale air as the night progresses. The oxygen content drops, the carbon dioxide builds up, and you're creating a humid, stuffy microclimate right around your face. It's unpleasant, and you might wake up several times during the night feeling short of breath, needing to poke your nose out into the frigid chamber air for a few deep breaths before retreating back into your blanket cave. This is the trade-off fresh air that might give you hypothermia, or stale air that keeps you warm enough to survive. Some healers understand that air quality matters even if they don't know about oxygen and carbon dioxide. The concept of bad air exists in medieval medicine. Air that's been breathed too many times, air that's trapped in closed spaces, air that carries disease. You might try to balance this by adjusting your bed curtains to allow some airflow while minimizing draft, or by keeping your face less covered despite the cold, or by periodically refreshing the air in your sleeping space. But honestly, most nights you're too exhausted and too cold to worry about optimal air quality. You just want to be warm enough to sleep. The psychological effect of sleeping with your head covered and your face mostly obscured is worth noting. You're cut off from visual information in a way that's nearly complete inside your curtained bed, under your blankets, with your cap and possibly scarf on. You might as well be blindfolded. Every sound is muffled. You can't see if there's danger approaching. This state of sensory deprivation could be frightening, and for some people it is. But for most it becomes associated with sleep, with safety, with the one time each day when you're not expected to be alert and responsive. The darkness and isolation are a relief, a permission to stop being vigilant. Your face in the morning tells the story of your night. If it's a day cold enough that you've been breathing into your blankets, your skin is slightly chapped from the humid air and the friction against wool. Your lips might be dry despite the moisture because wool wicks away oils. There might be red marks on your cheeks from where the fabric pressed against your skin all night. Your beard, if you have one, might have small ice crystals in it from your frozen breath. You look like someone who's been through an ordeal, which is accurate because sleep in a medieval castle isn't rest in any gentle sense. It's an 8-hour survival exercise that you pass every morning by waking up alive. Now picture this scenario because it happens regularly, and it's one of the unique nightmares of being a healer in a freezing castle. Someone is dying at 2 a.m. and you need to get out of bed. Right now. Not in 5 minutes after you've mentally prepared yourself. Now. There's pounding on your door, shouting panic in voices that cuts through your sleep, and your professional duty is about to collide head first with the reality that leaving your warm bed might be the hardest thing you do all week. You're cocooned in your layers, 4 wool blankets, possibly bed curtains, definitely multiple clothing layers, your nightcap, everything arranged just so to maintain that precious pocket of warmth you've spent hours building. Your body has finally stopped shivering. You've achieved something resembling actual sleep. And now you need to dismantle your entire survival system and venture into air that's probably 25 to 30 degrees colder than the space you're occupying. The temperature shock alone could be dangerous if you're not careful. The first movement is always the hardest. You have to convince your warm, half-asleep body to initiate action when every instinct screams to stay motionless. You push back the top blanket, immediately cold air rushes into the gap you've created. Then the second blanket. By the third blanket, you're fully awake because the cold is now unavoidable. If you have bed curtains, you fumble for the opening, pull them aside, and the full force of your chamber's temperature hits you like a physical blow. Your face, which was warm or at least not actively painful, suddenly feels frozen. Your eyes water from the temperature change. You need light, which means finding your tinderbox and lighting a candle, which means having enough dexterity in your rapidly chilling fingers to strike sparks and coax them into flame. This can take several tries on a cold night when your hands are shaking not from fear, but from the sudden temperature drop. The tallow candle, when it finally lights, gives off its characteristic animal fat smell and provides barely enough illumination to navigate your chamber without tripping over your medical supplies. That small flame also produces almost no heat, though you instinctively hold your hands near it for whatever psychological comfort it provides. Your feet hit the floor, and that's another shock entirely. Stone or wood doesn't matter. Both feel like ice against your wool-covered feet. You need actual shoes or boots now, not just hose, and those shoes have been sitting in your freezing chamber all night. The leather is cold and stiff, resistant to being put on. Your fingers already clumsy with cold struggle with laces or buckles. Every second you're out of bed, you're getting colder, and every second someone is dying and waiting for you. You grab your medical bag, the one you keep pre-packed for exactly this kind of emergency. Linen rolls for bandaging, herbs and tinctures in small bottles, a knife for bloodletting or surgery, whatever remedies you think might be needed based on the shouted information you're receiving. The Lord's son fever broke wrong, he's not breathing right, come now. Your professional training takes over even while your body is screaming about the cold. You pull on an additional outer cloak, something heavy that you definitely weren't sleeping in because you're about to walk through castle corridors that are even colder than your chamber. The corridors of a medieval castle at night are genuinely dangerous spaces. There's no ambient light except what you're carrying. The stone walls are slick with condensation or ice. The floors are uneven, possibly with rushes or straw scattered on them that hide irregularities where you could turn an ankle. Other people might be moving through the darkness, servants, guards, rats, who knows, and collision is a real possibility. You're trying to move quickly because someone's life is at stake, but not so quickly that you fall or drop your candle, which would leave you in absolute darkness. The cold in the corridors is often worse than in your chamber because moving air is more efficient at stealing heat than still air. Drafts flow through these passages like invisible rivers, finding every gap in your clothing. Your breath creates enormous clouds of vapor that glow in your candlelight. Your candle flame streams sideways from the draft, threatening to go out. If it does, you'll have to stop and relight it. And on a windy night that might be impossible without finding shelter. Some healers carry a lantern instead of a bare candle. For exactly this reason, the enclosed flame is protected from drafts, though lanterns are heavier and more expensive. Historians still argue about how castle inhabitants navigated at night, whether there were torches kept burning in main corridors, whether people developed a kind of echolocation familiarity with their spaces, whether nighttime movement was rare enough that each instance was an ordeal. The evidence suggests all of these are partially true depending on the castle, the season, and the circumstances. What's certain is that moving through a castle at night is nothing like the daytime experience. You're in a different building entirely, one that's darker, colder, and filled with acoustic strangeness, where sounds echo unpredictably off stone. You finally reach your patient, maybe in the Lord's private chambers, if it's a family member, maybe in the servants' quarters, if it's someone else, maybe in the Great Hall, if someone collapsed there. The room has more people, more candles, more warmth from collective body heat, and possibly a fire that's been stoked for the emergency. You're still cold, but the immediate crisis demands your attention. You examine your patient, make decisions, administer treatments, do everything your training and experience suggests. Your hands, which were dangerously numb minutes ago, regain enough sensation to be functional as you work. The treatment might last an hour or 3 hours or all night. Sometimes you save them, sometimes you don't. The medical reality of the medieval period is that you're working with limited tools, limited understanding, and limited options. You do your best, which is all anyone can do. And then when it's over, whether the patient stabilizes or dies, you face the prospect of walking back through those frigid corridors to your chamber and starting the whole warming process over again. Your carefully built heat reserve is gone. You're going back to a bed that's now cold, blankets that are cold air that hasn't gotten any warmer. The walk back is somehow worse than the walk there because the urgency is gone. You're exhausted now, mentally and physically drained, and you're walking toward the prospect of shivering for another hour before you can sleep again. Some healers, after a night call, just find whatever warm spot exists in the castle and sleep there near the kitchen fire in the great hall if there are embers anywhere that's not their frozen chamber. This is a calculated decision, immediate warmth versus the security and privacy of your own space. There's no obviously right answer. Before you even get into bed, while you still have the motivation and mobility to do something proactive, there's an evening ritual that can make the difference between miserable sleep and slightly less miserable sleep, pre-warming your bed with portable heat sources. This is technology that's been refined over generations, passed down from grandmothers to mothers to children, and you're benefiting from centuries of accumulated wisdom about how to make cold fabric temporarily bearable. The most common tool is the warming pan, a covered metal pan with a long wooden handle filled with hot coals or embers from the fire. You've probably seen these in museums and thought they looked quaint. They're not quaint. They're survival equipment. The pan itself is usually brass or copper, because these metals conduct heat well with a perforated lid to let some heat escape while containing the embers. The wooden handle extends 2 or 3 feet so you can reach into your bed without burning yourself or setting your blankets on fire, which is a real risk that's killed people. You prepare your warming pan in the kitchen or near the Great Hall fire while you're still up, taking advantage of heat sources that are available during evening hours. You scoop hot coals or embers into the pan using a small shovel, careful not to take actual flames, because those are dangerous in enclosed metal, just glowing coals that radiate steady heat. Then you carry this carefully back to your chamber, another navigation challenge through cold corridors now, with the added excitement of carrying fire. The technique for using the warming pan requires patience and care. You slide it between your sheets and wool blankets, moving it slowly back and forth to distribute the heat. You're heating the fabric, yes, but more importantly, you're driving moisture out of your bedding. That accumulated dampness from previous nights, from the general humidity of a stone castle, from your own body moisture, the warming pan helps evaporate some of it. Drier bedding insulates better, which means you're not just adding temporary heat, you're improving the functionality of your entire sleeping system. You focus on the area where your core will lie, your torso, your hips, the central portion of the bed where your body heat will be concentrated. Warming your pillow area is also valuable because you'll be breathing that warmed air. You might spend 10 or 15 minutes doing this, moving the pan methodically, feeling the fabric gradually change from cold and slightly damp to warm and drier. When you finally remove the pan, your bed feels almost luxurious, almost welcoming. You know this warmth is temporary, it'll last maybe 30 minutes to an hour, but that's 30 minutes when you can relax instead of shiver, when your body can actually start to warm itself, instead of fighting a losing battle against cold bedding. The risks are real and not theoretical. Castle fires often started from warming pans used carelessly, coals spilling onto straw mattresses, embers smouldering unnoticed under blankets, until they caught flame. Hours later, panicked users dropping the hot pan when startled. You've probably treated burns from warming pans, everything from minor blisters to serious injuries when someone grabbed the metal part instead of the handle. Every winter, people die in fires that started with warming pans. But people also die from hypothermia without them. You're choosing between competing dangers and hoping your carefulness tips the odds in your favour. Some people use an even simpler technology, heated stones or bricks wrapped in cloth. You take a stone from near the hearth, not from directly in the fire because it might crack from temperature shock, and wrap it in multiple layers of wool or old linen. This bundle goes into your bed before you do place strategically at your feet or near your core. A large stone can retain heat for several hours, which is longer than most other warming methods. The downside is weight. A stone heavy enough to hold significant heat might weigh 10 or 15 pounds, which is awkward to transport and potentially painful if you accidentally roll onto it during the night. Historians still argue about how widespread these practices were across different social classes. Warming pans required metal craft, which made them expensive. Stones were free but required access to a substantial fire to heat properly. The evidence from household inventories suggests that warming pans were common in merchant and noble households, but rare among the poor. Heated stones were probably used by everyone who had access to fire, which was most people, but not all the very poorest, might not have their own hearth, and would depend on communal fires that weren't available in the evening. There's also the hot water bottle concept, though it's not quite what you're imagining. Medieval versions are pottery or metal vessels filled with boiling water, sealed and wrapped in fabric. These work beautifully if you can get them sealed properly without leaking, and if you don't mind the risk of burns if the seal fails during the night. The heat retention is excellent. Hot water holds thermal energy better than stones, but the preparation is more involved. You need boiling water, which means access to a fire and a vessel suitable for boiling. You need a container that can be sealed watertight. You need wrapping material. For a healer with medical supplies and knowledge, this is doable. For a common servant, probably not. Some creative souls use heated sand or salt in fabric bags. These materials hold heat reasonably well and conform to body shape better than rigid stones. You heat them near the fire, pour them into a sewn bag and tuck them into your bed. The sand or salt gradually releases its heat over an hour or two. The technique comes from Middle Eastern practices filtering into Europe through trade routes and crusader contact. It's less common than warming pans or stones, but definitely part of the available toolkit. The psychological component matters as much as the physical warmth. Knowing you're getting into a pre-warmed bed makes the whole ordeal of sleeping in a freezing castle feel slightly more manageable. It's a small victory against the cold, an assertion that you're not completely helpless. You heated this space through effort and planning. You've created a pocket of warmth in a hostile environment. That sense of agency of doing something rather than just enduring affects your mental state in ways that probably improve your actual ability to sleep. By the time you're ready to get into bed, your warming pan or stone or whatever method you've used has done its work. The fabric feels warm against your skin, not hot, just warm, which is almost shocking after hours in the cold. You slide in carefully, trying not to displace too much of the warmed bedding, and for those first few minutes you're actually comfortable. Your body stops shivering, your muscles relax. You might even feel something approaching cozy. It won't last, the cold will come creeping back as your portable heat source cools, but for now you've won. For now you're warm. And that's enough to let you slip into sleep before the cold fully returns. Let's rewind a few hours and talk about the pre-sleep meal, because what you eat before bed isn't just about satisfying hunger. It's strategic fuel for maintaining body temperature through 8 hours of cold. Medieval people understood through generations of experience that certain foods helped you stay warmer through the night, even if they couldn't explain the metabolic science behind it. The evening meal, especially in winter, was designed as much for thermal survival as for nutrition. Your supper happens in the early evening, maybe around 6 or 7 o'clock, while there's still activity in the castle and the kitchen fires are going. As a healer, you might eat in the Great Hall with other castle staff, or you might take food to your chamber if you're working on preparations or if you're antisocial after a long day of dealing with other people's bodies and complaints. Either way, what's on your trencher has been selected consciously or unconsciously for its warming properties. The foundation is almost always pottage, that thick grain-based stew that's the backbone of medieval working-class diet. Think of it as oatmeal's savoury, more substantial cousin. It's made from whatever grains are available: barley, oats, rye, sometimes wheat. If the harvest was good, boiled slowly until they break down into a thick porridge-like consistency. Into this base go vegetables, herbs, and if you're fortunate, some fat in the form of bacon, salt pork, or butter. The result is dense filling, and crucially, it takes a long time to digest. That slow digestion is key to the thermal strategy. Your body has to work to break down all those complex carbohydrates and proteins, and that work generates heat, something called the thermic effect of food. The warmth you feel after eating a substantial meal isn't just psychological, it's your metabolism ramping up to process nutrients. A big bowl of thick pottage eaten at 7 in the evening is still being digested at midnight, still producing metabolic heat that helps offset the cold you're sleeping in. The medieval medical theory behind this, which you as a healer would know, relates to the concept of humours and the idea that foods have inherent temperatures. Grains are considered hot in the humoral system, not because they're served hot, but because they're believed to heat the body from within. Oats especially are prized for winter eating because they're thought to strengthen and warm. Modern science would say this is mostly wrong, but the practical outcome eating dense carbohydrate-rich food before sleeping in the cold happens to be correct for different reasons. Fat is your other major ally. Any kind of animal fat butter stirred into pottage, bacon, grease cheese, if you can get it even tallow rendered from beef fat if you're desperate. Fat is calorie dense, which means it's energy dense, which means it's heat generating potential packed into small volume. A spoonful of butter in your evening pottage might add 200 calories that your body can burn through the night to maintain temperature. Medieval people didn't count calories, but they absolutely knew that fat made you feel warmer and that wealthy people who ate more fat seemed to tolerate cold better than the poor eating mostly grain and vegetables. You're also drinking something warm because getting hot liquid into your stomach provides immediate thermal benefit that lasts 30 minutes to an hour. Ale is the default beverage, lightly fermented, low alcohol, safer than water, because the brewing process killed pathogens. In winter, ale might be heated either by plunging a hot iron directly into it, or by warming the vessel near the fire. Spiced ale with honey is luxury, but not unattainable luxury. You might have this once a week or for special occasions. The spices cinnamon, ginger, clove, if you can afford imported spices, are believed to have warming properties, and modern research would partially agree because compounds in ginger do increase circulation and metabolic rates slightly. Some healers prepare specific warming drinks based on medical knowledge. A decoction of ginger and fennel in hot water, barley water with honey. In desperate times, even hot water with a bit of honey and some dried herbs is better than nothing. The point is getting heat into your core before you attempt sleep. That warmth spreads through your body, raises your core temperature by a degree or two, and gives you a head start on the long thermal battle ahead. Historians still argue whether the timing of evening meals varied by season or remained consistent year-round. The evidence suggests some seasonal variation in winter. People ate their main meals slightly later to maximize the time between eating and sleeping, giving them that digestive heat when they most needed it. In summer, with longer days and less extreme cold, meal timing was less critical and more driven by work schedules. Garlic appears frequently in winter pottage, and while medieval people valued it for its supposed ability to ward off disease and evil spirits, modern science confirms it does have genuine antimicrobial properties and increases circulation. A few cloves of garlic chopped into your evening meal means you're breathing garlic-scented breath all night, which is fine because everyone else is too. The shared smell of garlic, sweat wool, and smoke is the olfactory signature of medieval winter sleeping quarters. Onions serve a similar purpose. Cheap storable through winter, believed to have warming and protective properties, and actually containing compounds that boost immune function. Your evening pottage probably contains onions in some form, chopped, sliced, boiled until they're soft and sweet. Combined with grain and fat and whatever vegetables are available from storage, you've got a meal that provides sustained energy release over many hours. Some nights you're also eating bread, dark rye or barley bread, dense and chewy, maybe spread with butter if you have it. Bread is more refined than pottage, digests somewhat faster, but still provides solid carbohydrate fuel. You might eat it while your pottage is cooling, or soak it in the pottage to soften it and combine the two. The ritual of eating warm bread in a cold chamber, feeling the heat of it in your hands before it goes into your mouth, is a small comfort that matters more than it logically should. What you're not eating before bed is much fresh fruit or raw vegetables, because these are considered cold foods in humoral theory, and because honestly they're not available in winter anyway. Preserved fruit, dried apples, pears, plums might appear occasionally, but they're treats rather than staples. The medieval winter diet is heavy, dense, monotonous, and specifically calibrated for survival rather than variety or pleasure. After eating, you feel genuinely warmer for the first time all day. Your stomach is full and actively digesting. Your core temperature has risen. You might even be sweating slightly under all your layers. This is the optimal time to get into your pre-warmed bed before that food-generated heat dissipates while your body is running hot from digestion. You're stacking every possible advantage full stomach. Warm food, preheated bedding, all your layers, because you need every single one of them to make it through the night. Here's an advantage you have that most other people in the castle don't you. Sleep near your medicines, and your medicines sleep near you. Your herb room, or the storage area attached to your chamber, isn't just a workspace. It's an accidentally climate-controlled environment that provides genuine benefits you probably don't fully appreciate until you spend a night somewhere else. Those bundles of dried plants hanging from your rafters and stacked on your shelves aren't just medical supplies. They're environmental modifiers that make your sleeping space genuinely different from the rest of the castle. The herbs themselves, thyme, rosemary, lavender, sage, mint, chamomile, dozens of others depending on what you've harvested and what conditions you treat, are hygroscopic to varying degrees. This means they naturally absorb moisture from the air. In a stone castle where dampness is a constant problem, where condensation forms on walls, and your breath adds humidity all night, having several pounds of dried plant material in your chamber actually helps regulate moisture levels. The air in your space is drier than it would otherwise be, which means your bedding stays drier, which means it insulates better. You didn't plan this, it's a happy accident of necessity, but you're benefiting from it every night. The scent is the most obvious difference. While the rest of the castle smells like smoke-unwashed bodies, animal fat and general medieval funk, your chamber has layers of herbal aroma that overlay and partially mask the unpleasant base notes. When you take a deep breath in your space, you're inhaling rosemary and lavender, and thyme sharp and green and clean. This isn't just pleasant, it's psychologically powerful. Smell is directly connected to memory and emotion, in ways medieval people didn't understand but definitely experienced. Those herbal scents signal safety competence, your professional identity. They make your chamber feel like your space, in a way that generic cold stone never could. Some of those herbs have actual pharmacological effects when their volatile compounds are inhaled continuously. Lavender is mildly sedating. Modern research confirms this wasn't just folk wisdom. Breathing lavender-scented air over hours genuinely helps you relax and sleep more deeply. Chamomile has similar properties. Even if the effects are subtle in an environment where sleep is already difficult, any edge matters. You're essentially using passive aromatherapy without knowing that's what you're doing, and it's working. The herbs also provide minimal but real insulation. Those bundles hanging from rafters create a slight barrier against heat rising straight through your ceiling. Think of them as accidental thermal mass. They absorb heat during any warm period and release it slowly. A chamber packed with dried plants has different thermal properties than an empty stone room. The difference is small, maybe a degree or two, but remember that you're operating on such narrow margins that a single degree can be significant. Certain herbs were specifically believed to have protective properties during sleep. Mugwort hung near the bed was supposed to prevent nightmares, and protect against evil spirits. St. John's wort was thought to ward off demons that attacked during the night. Whether these beliefs have any basis in reality is debatable, though mugwort does contain compounds that affect dreams and sleep patterns, but the psychological comfort of sleeping surrounded by protective plants is real. You feel safer, which helps you relax, which improves sleep quality. The storage vessels themselves, ceramic jars, wooden boxes, fabric bags, add to the room's insulation and thermal mass. A shelf full of heavy ceramic jars filled with ointments and tinctures represents dozens of pounds of material that moderates temperature swings. When your chamber gets slightly warm during the day, those jars absorb heat. At night, they release it slowly. You're living in a space that has thermal inertia, that resists rapid temperature changes, unlike the empty servant quarters where the temperature drops instantly when the sun sets. Historians still argue about how much medieval people understood about air quality, and how much was superstition versus practical observation. The evidence suggests a mix. They knew that some spaces felt better for sleeping without understanding the mechanisms. A healer's herb room felt better because it was drier, smelled better, and had those subtle pharmacological effects from volatile compounds. The explanations involved miasma theory and humoral balance, which were wrong, but the practical outcome, seeking out well-ventilated spaces with pleasant herbs, was correct. Your work supplies also mean you have access to warming preparations that other castle inhabitants don't. A jar of rendered goose fat that you use for making ointments can also be rubbed on your chest and feet before bed as insulation against the cold. This is folk practice that has some legitimacy. A layer of fat on the skin does provide minimal insulation and prevents moisture loss. It's messy and it smells, but on the worst nights you use what you have. You might have alcohol-based tinctures, medicines extracted in wine or distilled spirits. These have warmth-generating properties when consumed in small amounts. A spoonful of strong tincture before bed provides a brief internal warming sensation, as the alcohol dilates blood vessels and creates the illusion of warmth. It's not sustainable heat. Alcohol actually makes you lose body warmth faster overall, but for the 10 minutes it takes to fall asleep, that sensation of warmth can be the difference between anxious wakefulness and rest. You know as a healer that this is a trade-off. Possibly not a good one, but you're human, and sometimes the short-term relief wins. The simple fact of being surrounded by the tools of your profession provides comfort that's hard to quantify. These herbs and preparations represent your competence, your value to the castle community, your ability to help others and yourself. In a world where most people feel powerless against cold and disease and hardship, you have knowledge and resources. You can't fix the cold, nobody can, but you can mitigate it in small ways. You can treat the frostbite and respiratory infections it causes. You can prepare warming drinks and protective ointments. Your chamber isn't just where you sleep. It's your workshop, your arsenal against suffering. Some nights when sleep won't come despite exhaustion, you might get up and work with your herbs by candlelight. Grinding dried leaves with your mortar and pestle, the familiar motion soothing the sharp smell of crushed rosemary filling the small space. Preparing a salve you'll need tomorrow, or sorting through your supplies, or simply doing something purposeful to distract from the cold. The work generates a small amount of body heat from muscle activity, and the mental engagement helps override the discomfort signals your body is sending. By the time you're done and back in bed, you're tired enough that sleep comes easier despite the cold. Now we need to address one of the least romantic but most important aspects of surviving castle nights. You have a dog sleeping with you, or if you don't, you desperately wish you did. Not a pet in the modern sense, though affection certainly develops, but a functional heat source that breathes, generates warmth continuously, and asks for nothing more than scraps from your dinner and permission to sleep on your bed. This is technology disguised as companionship, and it's been keeping humans alive through cold nights for thousands of years. The phrase three-dog night comes from exactly this practice, a night so cold that you need 3 dogs sleeping with you to survive. 1 dog provides noticeable warmth. 2 dogs create a genuinely warmer sleeping environment. 3 dogs, and you're approaching something resembling comfort. Medieval people understood this completely. Dogs weren't just for hunting and guarding. They were portable heaters that recharged themselves by eating your food scraps. The dogs sleeping in castles are working dogs, hunting hounds, guard dogs, ratters, not decorative lapdogs. Those smaller dogs existed and served their own purposes. A medium to large dog generates about the same amount of heat as a human child, somewhere between 100 and 150 watts of thermal output. That might not sound like much, but in a bed where you're desperate for every calorie of warmth you can find, a dog is a significant asset. They're also available to everyone, unlike braziers or fur blankets or other luxury heating methods. Even the poorest servants might have access to a dog that sleeps in their quarters. Your dog, let's assume you have one, because most healers do, is probably a mongrel of uncertain heritage, medium-sized with a thick coat that's designed for outdoor work in English weather. Maybe it's technically the castle's dog assigned to rat control in the storage areas, but it's formed a bond with you through consistent feeding and kind treatment. Dogs are remarkably good at figuring out which humans will share food and warmth. This dog has chosen you or you've chosen it, and now you have a sleeping companion that provides more practical benefit than most human bed partners, without the social complications. The dog's position in your sleeping arrangement is negotiable and changes throughout the night. Sometimes it's at your feet, lying across your ankles and lower legs, providing crucial warmth to extremities that are hardest to keep warm. The weight of the dog also helps hold blankets in place against your legs, preventing gaps where cold air could infiltrate. Sometimes the dog migrates during the night to lie along your back or side, pressed against you through the blankets. That contact transfers heat through conduction and creates a warm zone that benefits both of you. Dogs have higher body temperatures than humans, about 101 to 102 degrees Fahrenheit, compared to human 98.6, which means they're literally warmer to touch. That temperature differential drives heat transfer in your direction, which is exactly what you need. The dog's fur provides insulation that traps heat against your body, creating a microclimate between you and the animal that's several degrees warmer than the ambient air. Medieval people didn't know the thermodynamics, but they knew that sleeping with the dog meant being warmer, and that was enough. The practical benefits extend beyond just warmth. A dog in your chamber provides security in ways that matter in a medieval castle. Dogs have better hearing than humans, they'll wake to sounds you'd sleep through, and their alert behaviour warns you if something's wrong. An intruder trying to enter your chamber at night would have to deal with a barking dog before reaching you. This isn't paranoia. Castle politics could be dangerous. Valuable medicines could be targets for theft, and violence wasn't uncommon. A dog is both deterrent and alarm system. Historians still argue about whether dogs sleeping with humans was universal or primarily a peasant practice that nobility avoided. The evidence is mixed. Some noble accounts mention beloved hunting dogs sleeping in chambers. Other sources suggest it was considered somewhat crude to share your bed with animals. The reality probably varied by individual preference and specific circumstances. What's clear is that among healers, servants and working people, generally dogs sleeping in quarters was completely normal and unremarkable. The downsides are obvious and accepted as inevitable. Dogs smell especially when they're wet or haven't been bathed in months, which is always. Your chamber and your bedding now carry that distinctive dog odour, mixed with all the other smells you're living with. Dogs have fleas guaranteed, and those fleas transfer to your bed and your body. You're already dealing with fleas from your straw mattress, so the dog's contribution is just adding to the existing population. Dogs sometimes scratch, shake, dream chase rabbits in their sleep with running motions that disturb your rest. They might need to go outside during the night, which means you have to get up and let them out or deal with the consequences in the morning. But the cost-benefit analysis always favours having the dog. The warmth is too valuable. On the coldest nights, when you're shivering despite all your blankets, and you're genuinely worried about whether you'll make it to morning, the dog sleeping against your back or legs is providing comfort that's both physical and emotional. You're not alone. There's another living, breathing, warm creature sharing this ordeal with you. That matters more than cleanliness or flea bites or interrupted sleep. Some healers have cats instead of, or in addition to dogs. Cats are smaller and generate less heat, but they're enthusiastic heat seekers who will burrow under blankets and sleep directly against your body. A cat purring against your chest or stomach provides warmth, rhythmic vibration that's soothing and genuinely helps some people sleep better. Cats also control the mouse population in your herb stores, which is their professional job, but their nighttime warmth contribution is a valued secondary benefit. The old stereotype of the solitary cat-owning healer exists because it was practical cats keep rodents out of medicines and keep healers warm at night. Multiple animals are even better if you can manage it. A dog and a cat both sleeping in your bed means you're bracketed by heat sources. One at your feet, one curled against your stomach or back, and suddenly you're the middle element in a small heat-sharing collective. The animals also benefit, they're warmer sleeping with you than they would be alone, so everyone wins. This is cooperation at its most basic. Mammals recognizing that shared warmth increases survival chances for all involved. Your relationship with your sleeping dog develops depth over months and years of shared cold nights. You learn its sleeping patterns, its preferred positions, its sounds and movements. The dog learns yours. There's communication happening. The dog senses when you're having difficulty sleeping and adjusts position to provide more contact. You unconsciously shift to accommodate the dog's comfort because you want it to stay rather than leave. It's not quite friendship in the human sense, but it's partnership, mutual dependence, and genuine affection that develops through shared survival. Before you close your eyes and surrender to whatever sleep you can achieve, there's one more ritual that nearly everyone in the castle performs regardless of their station or how exhausted they are. Prayer. This isn't optional religious observance that you can skip when you're tired. It's as fundamental to the pre-sleep routine as putting on your nightcap, and it serves purposes that go beyond theology. Prayer is psychological preparation, community connection, and anxiety management wrapped in religious language, and you need it to sleep in conditions that would otherwise be overwhelming. The most basic prayer is short and formulaic, something you've said every night since childhood. In nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti. In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, followed by a brief plea for protection through the night. You make the sign of the cross over yourself, maybe over your bed, definitely over any children or dependents in your care. This takes 30 seconds and requires almost no mental engagement. It's rote automatic, the spiritual equivalent of locking your door before bed. But many nights you pray longer, more earnestly, because you're genuinely frightened, and prayer is how medieval people process fear. You're about to spend 8 hours unconscious in a stone room that's barely above freezing, in a world where people regularly die in their sleep from cold, from disease, from accidents, from violence. You have no control over whether you'll wake up tomorrow. None. Prayer gives you the illusion of agency. You're appealing to a higher power that theoretically does have control, and the act of making that appeal helps calm the anxiety that would otherwise keep you awake. The prayers you know specifically address nighttime dangers. There are prayers against nightmares, against demons that attack sleepers, against sudden death, against fire, against illness that strikes in the dark hours. Medieval Christianity has a prayer for everything, and you've memorized dozens over your lifetime. Some you learned from your mother, some from priests, some from other healers. You cycle through them depending on what you're most worried about on any given night. Worried about the cough that's been bothering you. There's a prayer to St. Blaise for throat ailments. Worried about the castle's vulnerability to raiders. Prayer to St. Michael for protection. The rhythm of prayer itself is soothing, independent of content. The repetitive phrases, the familiar cadence, the act of speaking or thinking words. You've said thousands of times this induces a meditative state that lowers anxiety and heart rate. Modern psychology recognizes this as a relaxation technique. You're not thinking about it in those terms. You're praying because that's what everyone does and because not praying would be unthinkable. But the effect is the same. You're calming your nervous system through ritual repetition. Group prayer happens too, especially if you're sharing your chamber with an apprentice or assistant. Praying together bonds you, reminds you both that you're part of a larger Christian community, and creates shared experience that helps both of you feel less alone. You might take turns leading, or recite prayers in unison, or simply pray silently in each other's presence. Either way, it's a moment of deliberate pause before sleep, an acknowledgement that you're both vulnerable, and you're facing that vulnerability together. Historians still argue about how deeply medieval people actually believed, versus how much religious practice was social conformity. The evidence suggests it varied enormously by individual, but what's clear is that the rituals themselves served genuine psychological purposes, whether or not the supernatural beliefs behind them were sincere. Praying before sleep helped people sleep, which made the prayer work in a practical sense, regardless of divine intervention. Some healers incorporate their medical knowledge into prayer. You might pray for your patients by name, asking for their recovery, or for a peaceful death if recovery isn't possible. This serves multiple purposes. It helps you mentally review your cases and think through treatment plans. It provides emotional processing for the difficult parts of your job, and it reinforces your identity as a caregiver. You're not just someone who happens to know medicine. You're someone whose calling involves both skill and compassion, both earthly knowledge and spiritual concern. There are also protective rituals that blur the line between prayer and magic. You might make the sign of the cross over your medical supplies to protect them from corruption. You might bless your bed with holy water, a few drops sprinkled on the corners to ward off evil influences. You might have a small relic or blessed object under your pillow or hanging near your bed. Medieval Christianity officially distinguished between prayer acceptable and magic heresy, but in practice the boundary was fuzzy, and most people engaged in both without seeing much difference. The act of kneeling to pray, even briefly, has physical effects worth noting. It changes your position after you've been hunched over or standing all day. It creates a distinct transition between day activities and sleep time. It's a posture of humility and submission that might help release the tension of constantly being in charge of other people's medical care. For a few minutes, you're not the healer, the expert, the person with answers. You're just another vulnerable human asking for help. Your final prayer of the night is often the shortest. Lord, if it be thy will, let me wake tomorrow. This isn't melodramatic, it's realistic. People die in their sleep with sufficient frequency that it's a recognized risk. You've probably prepared bodies in the morning of people who went to bed alive and never woke up. You know exactly how fragile life is, so you ask simply to see another dawn. You commend your soul to God's keeping, and you hope that's enough. The religious framework also provides meaning to suffering in ways that make it more bearable. You're not just cold and miserable for no reason. You're enduring hardship in a world that's fallen from grace, and that suffering has spiritual significance. It's a chance to demonstrate faith, to purify your soul, to participate in the suffering of Christ. This isn't masochism. It's a coping mechanism that transforms meaningless discomfort into purposeful trial. Whether you fully believe this or just find it comforting doesn't matter. It helps you endure, and endurance is what survival requires. After your prayers, you settle into your bed with a different mental state than you'd have without them. You're calmer. You've processed your fears through ritual. You've connected to something larger than yourself and your immediate discomfort. You've performed the same actions your parents did and their parents before them, an unbroken chain of humans facing the night, with faith and hope and whatever courage they could muster. Now it's your turn. You close your eyes, pull your blankets tight, and trust that morning will come. Here's something that would confuse and possibly horrify a modern sleep specialist. You don't actually expect to sleep straight through the night. Nobody does. The concept of 8 consecutive hours of unconsciousness is not how medieval people experience sleep, and it's not how humans naturally sleep when artificial lighting doesn't exist to manipulate circadian rhythms. What you're anticipating is something called segmented sleep. First sleep, a period of waking, and second sleep. And this pattern is so universal in your world that there isn't even a special name for it. It's just sleep. Your first sleep begins sometime between 8 and 10 in the evening, depending on the season, and when darkness made work impossible. You fall asleep relatively quickly because you're exhausted from a full day of physical and mental labor. You've eaten your warming supper, you've done your prayers, and your body desperately needs rest. This first sleep is deep restorative, the kind where you barely move, and dreams are minimal or forgotten. Your body is doing essential maintenance, repairing tissue, consolidating memories, regulating hormones, all the things that require reduced consciousness. This first sleep lasts somewhere between 3 and 5 hours. Then, usually sometime between midnight and 2 in the morning, you wake up. Not from a nightmare or an external disturbance, not because something's wrong, you just wake up. Your eyes open in the darkness, you're fully conscious, and you're not going back to sleep immediately. This is completely normal. This is what sleep is supposed to look like. The term used in historical documents when it's mentioned at all is first sleep and second sleep, with the wakeful period between them sometimes called the watching. During this wakeful period, you're not anxious about being awake. There's no medieval equivalent of staring at the clock worrying about how much sleep you're losing. You accept this waking as natural, and you use the time in various ways depending on your needs and circumstances. Sometimes you pray not the rushed bedtime prayers, but longer, more meditative contemplation. The night hours are considered especially appropriate for prayer because the world is quiet, and you're closer to God in the darkness and stillness. Sometimes you use this time for intimate conversation if you're sharing your bed. The darkness and privacy create a space for discussions that wouldn't happen during the day. You might talk with your bed partner about worries, plans, feelings, things that are easier to say when you can't see each other's faces and when the rest of the castle is asleep. Historical documents occasionally reference important decisions made during these nighttime conversations, suggesting that the wakeful period between sleeps was valued time for connection and reflection. Some people get up during the watching period. You might relieve yourself using the chamber pot rather than holding it until morning. You might check on a patient if you're worried about someone. You might adjust your blankets, reposition yourself in bed, let the dog out or back in. You might even get up and do light work by candlelight if there's something on your mind, preparing a medicine you'll need tomorrow, checking your supplies, reading if you're literate, and have access to texts. Though this is rare because candles are expensive and most healers aren't reading Latin medical texts in the middle of the night. More often, you stay in bed during the watching, conserving your hard-won warmth, and simply existing in a state of relaxed wakefulness. You might think about your patients running through symptoms and treatments in your mind. You might review the day's events or plan tomorrow's activities. You might pray or meditate or simply lie there listening to the sounds of the castle at night. Other people stirring in distant rooms, animals, moving wind, the creaks and groans of timber and stone responding to temperature changes. Historians still argue about how universal segmented sleep actually was, and whether it persisted across all social classes. The documentary evidence comes primarily from diaries, letters, and literary references from people wealthy enough to be literate, which introduces selection bias. But the pattern appears so consistently across different cultures and time periods that it seems to represent a genuine human sleep architecture that emerged before artificial lighting allowed consolidated sleep. The watching period typically lasts 1 to 2 hours. Then, without any particular trigger, you start to feel drowsy again. Your body's ready for second sleep. You adjust your position, pull your blankets tighter if they've loosened, say a brief prayer, or simply close your eyes and you slip back into sleep. This second sleep is different from the first, lighter, more prone to dreams, easier to wake from. It lasts until dawn, or until someone wakes you, usually another 3 to 4 hours. The total sleep time across both periods is roughly 7 to 8 hours, which is similar to modern recommendations, but the pattern is completely different. The break in the middle means your sleep is less efficient. In some ways, you're spending time awake when you could theoretically be resting, but it might actually be more natural for human physiology. Some sleep researchers argue that segmented sleep better matches our evolutionary history and might even have advantages for memory consolidation and emotional processing. For you as a healer, the watching period has particular utility. If a medical emergency happens during the night, and they do, you're more likely to be between sleeps and therefore more alert and capable of responding. You're not being dragged from deep unconsciousness into a crisis. You're already awake or only lightly sleeping. This might be part of why healers survive in the profession. Your natural sleep patterns align with the demands of nighttime medical care. The segmented sleep pattern also means you're never unconscious for dangerously long periods in a dangerously cold environment. You're checking in with your body twice per night. Is everything still functioning? Are you still warm enough? Is anything wrong? This built-in safety check might have genuine survival value in conditions where hypothermia is a real risk. You're monitoring yourself without consciously deciding to, and if something's seriously wrong during the watching period, you can take action rather than sleeping through a developing crisis. Modern people who accidentally experience segmented sleep, waking in the middle of the night and staying awake for an hour, often interpret this as insomnia and become anxious about it. You don't have that framework. You're not broken or sick. You're sleeping normally. This psychological difference matters enormously for sleep quality. You're relaxed during the watching, not stressed, which means you fall back into second sleep easily. Your sleep isn't being disrupted by anxiety about the sleep itself, which is a peculiarly modern problem. As you drift into second sleep, you're vaguely aware that dawn is still hours away but approaching. You'll wake when the castle begins to stir, when you hear activity in corridors or someone banging pots in the kitchen. For now you're back in that state of unconsciousness that feels like falling into deep, dark water. The cold is still there, pressing in from all sides, but you've made it through first sleep and most of the watching. Second sleep will carry you to morning. You've survived another night. Let's address the situation nobody wants to talk about but everyone has to deal with. You need to urinate in the middle of the night, and the prospect of leaving your warm bed to do so is genuinely terrible. This isn't a minor inconvenience. It's a calculated risk assessment that happens multiple times per week, weighing bladder discomfort against the ordeal of exposing yourself to frigid air and then trying to rebuild your warmth afterward. Sometimes the bladder wins. Sometimes you hold it until morning and regret that choice for different reasons. Your chamber pot is probably ceramic or metal sitting somewhere within reach of your bed, but not so close that you'll kick it over in the dark. If you're fortunate, it has a lid to contain smells. If you're not, it's just an open vessel that will radiate its contents' odour all night once used. The pot itself is cold. It's been sitting in your freezing chamber for hours, which makes the experience even less appealing. Sitting on or positioning yourself over a cold ceramic rim in the middle of the night while mostly naked is memorably unpleasant. The decision process goes something like this: you wake during your watching period, or from first sleep and you're aware of bladder pressure. Not urgent yet, but present. You're warm, or at least not actively miserable. You calculate, if I get up now, I'll lose all this accumulated warmth. I'll have to leave my bed, find the chamber pot in the dark, remove enough clothing to manage the task complete, it while shivering, then get back into a bed that's now noticeably colder because I've been gone, and then I'll spend 30 minutes shivering and trying to warm up again. Is it worth it? Can I hold this until morning? Sometimes you hold it. You shift position to reduce the pressure. You think about other things you do, whatever mental tricks help you ignore your bladder, and you try to fall back asleep. This works until it doesn't. You wake an hour later with more urgent pressure, or you make it to morning, but you're uncomfortable the entire time and your sleep quality suffers. There's also the risk of urinary tract infections from holding urine too long, especially for women, though medieval people didn't understand the mechanism. They just knew that sometimes holding it led to painful urination and illness later. More often, especially if you wake during the watching period when you're already somewhat alert, you give in to necessity. You push back your blankets, immediate cold shock, and feel for the edge of the bed in complete darkness. Your eyes have adjusted somewhat to the dark enough to see vague shapes but not details. You locate the chamber pot by memory and feel, hoping you've remembered its exact position correctly, because knocking it over would be a disaster that ruins your entire night. The clothing situation depends on what you're wearing. If you're a man in tunics and hose, you can manage with minimal removal. If you're a woman in longer garments, you're gathering fabric and trying to keep it clear, while also trying to maintain some warmth and not expose more skin than absolutely necessary. The whole operation is awkward, uncomfortable, and undignified. You're a respected healer, a skilled professional, and right now you're squatting over a pot in the dark trying not to splash. Historians still argue about the specifics of nighttime elimination practices, whether people routinely left their chambers to use communal facilities, whether they always used chamber pots, whether there were differences by status and gender. The evidence suggests enormous variation. Some castle chambers had guardrobe shafts, basically holes in the wall that dropped waist-down exterior walls built into or near sleeping quarters. Most didn't. Most people use chamber pots and empty them in the morning, and that's what you're dealing with. The sound of urination in a quiet chamber is surprisingly loud. If you're sharing your space with an apprentice or assistant, they definitely know what you're doing. This bothers nobody because privacy around bodily functions is not a medieval concept. Everyone urinates, everyone defecates, Everyone does these things in proximity to others, and shame about it is minimal. Still, there's something particularly vulnerable about squatting over a pot in the middle of the night while someone else is theoretically asleep a few feet away. After you finish, you have to clean yourself somehow. If you're prepared, you have cloth rags for this purpose, reusable fabric that gets washed periodically, though not as often as modern hygiene would demand. If you're not prepared, you're using whatever's available or just dealing with inadequate cleanliness until morning. You return the chamber pot to its position, making sure it's stable and not likely to spill. Then comes the worst part, getting back into bed. Your bed has cooled during your absence. Not dramatically, you've only been gone a few minutes, but enough that you notice. The spot where you are lying is still the warmest area, but it's not as warm as it was, and the edges where you didn't cover are definitely colder. You climb back in, pull your blankets over yourself, and wait for the shivering to stop. This takes longer than you'd like. You're now wide awake, cold, and annoyed at your bladder for making this necessary. The dog, if you have one, might have shifted position during your absence and is now occupying your warm spot. You have to negotiate with the dog, physically pushing it aside or bribing it with affection to move. The dog is not happy about this disruption either. Its sleep has been interrupted, its warm position disturbed, and it lets you know through grumbles and reluctant repositioning. Eventually you both settle back into the sleeping arrangement pressed together for mutual warmth, and you try to return to sleep. Some nights you opt for a truly desperate solution. You urinate in the chamber pot without fully getting out of bed. You lean over the side, manage the logistics somehow, and complete the task with minimal loss of warmth and position. This is difficult, requires practice and flexibility, and has obvious risks if you miscalculate. But it minimizes heat loss and disruption, which sometimes makes it worth the awkwardness. Medieval people were practical about survival, and if this works, it works. Dignity is negotiable when you're fighting the cold. The chamber pot's contents will remain there until morning, which means you're spending the rest of the night in a room that now smells like urine. If the pot has a lid, this is manageable. If not, the smell becomes part of the general olfactory landscape of your chamber, mixing with all the other smells you're living with. By morning you've adapted and barely notice it, but if you wake up during second sleep, you're reminded that your sleeping chamber is also your bathroom. Morning means emptying the chamber pot, which is one of the day's first tasks. You carry it to wherever waste gets disposed, a guardrobe shaft, the moat, a cesspit, or just thrown out a window if castle management is particularly casual about sanitation. The pot gets rinsed, maybe with cold water. It returns to your chamber ready for tonight's repeat performance. This is your daily cycle, unglamorous but essential part of the basic maintenance of staying alive in a medieval castle. Not all healers sleep in the same conditions, and it's worth examining how your survival strategies change depending on your position in the medieval hierarchy. A physician serving a wealthy noble family experiences winter nights very differently than a village wise woman helping peasants, even though both are technically healers. Your status determines not just your comfort but your actual survival odds, and understanding this hierarchy reveals a lot about how medieval society functioned at its most basic level. At the top you have university-educated physicians serving kings and high nobility. These are rare individuals, there might be only a few dozen in all of England at any given time. If you're in this category, your winter sleeping situation is as good as medieval technology allows. You're in a castle's better quarters, possibly with an actual fireplace that has a proper chimney. Your bed has full curtains, probably lined with fur. You have multiple fur blankets, feather pillows, and servants whose job includes keeping your chamber as warm as possible. You might even have a dedicated servant sleeping in your chamber to tend the fire through the night and respond to your needs. This luxury is relative, of course. You're still cold by modern standards, still dealing with drafts and dampness, still vulnerable to the same diseases and dangers as everyone else. But your odds of surviving to old age are significantly better than healers further down the hierarchy, partly because of medical knowledge, but largely because you're simply warmer and better fed. Hypothermia and cold-related illnesses kill far fewer wealthy people than poor ones, which is obvious but worth stating explicitly. One level down, you have castle healers like the version of you we've been discussing. Not noble-born, but respected professionals with secure positions. You get a private chamber access to castle resources, regular meals, and the ability to accumulate bedding and supplies over years of service. You're not comfortable, but you're survivable. You're in that middle zone where cold is a constant hardship but not usually a lethal threat, assuming you're healthy and reasonably young. This is probably where most of this story has been positioning you. Monastery and convent healers occupy an interesting parallel category. The religious communities you're part of have different priorities than secular castles. Comfort is explicitly devalued, suffering is spiritually beneficial, and excessive warmth would be suspicious luxury. But monasteries also pool resources effectively and take care of their members as a matter of theological principle. You might sleep in a slightly warmer dormitory with other monastics sharing body heat, even if the beds are deliberately austere. The infirmary where you work has better heating than other monastery buildings because caring for the sick is holy work. Your survival odds are reasonably good, though not as high as wealthy physicians. Village healers, the wise women herbalists and bone setters who serve rural communities face much harsher conditions. You're living in a peasant cottage with a central hearth and no chimney, meaning smoke fills the interior before finding its way out through gaps in the thatch roof. Your bed is straw on the floor, or a simple wooden platform with whatever blankets you've managed to accumulate through payment in kind. You might sleep with your entire family in one room, sharing warmth, but also diseases. The cold penetrates more easily than in stone castles. Timber and wattle and daub construction has more gaps, but paradoxically the smaller space and constant low fire might keep temperatures more stable than castle chambers. Your payment as a village healer comes primarily in food cloth and small amounts of coin, which means your ability to accumulate survival resources depends entirely on your community's prosperity and generosity. A bad harvest year means less food, less fat in your diet, less ability to maintain body temperature. You're more vulnerable to the cold weather mortality that spikes every winter, and if you die, the community loses its healer until someone else develops the knowledge and skills to replace you. This creates some incentive for the village to keep you alive, but that incentive competes with everyone else's survival needs. Historians still argue about whether medieval people recognized the connection between poverty, cold, and mortality in the systematic way we do now. The evidence suggests they understood it practically, if not statistically. Everyone knew that winter killed the old, the young, and the poor more than others, even if they attributed it to God's will or humoral imbalances rather than straightforward hypothermia and malnutrition. The social hierarchy in sleeping conditions was accepted as natural, divinely ordained even, rather than something that could or should be changed. Travelling healers, those without permanent positions who move from place to place, offering services, have the worst of it. You're sleeping in whatever accommodation you can afford or barter for, which often means shared beds in common rooms with complete strangers. You're providing your own blankets or paying extra for them. You have no ability to accumulate supplies or establish a comfortable sleeping space because you're constantly moving. Your survival strategy is purely reactive. Get through tonight, move tomorrow. Repeat. Mortality rates among itinerant workers of all types are significantly higher than settled populations, and travelling healers are no exception. Gender affects your situation across all these categories. Women healers, regardless of status, face additional vulnerabilities. You're less likely to be university educated because universities don't accept women. You're more likely to be suspected of witchcraft if your treatments fail or if you're too successful. You have less social power to demand payment or better conditions. But you also have advantages. Women's healing knowledge often passes through family lines and community networks, giving you practical skills that complement or exceed academic medicine. You're more integrated into domestic spaces, which can mean better access to kitchen fires and shared warmth, though also more labour demands that drain your energy. Age matters enormously. Young healers have better circulation, faster metabolisms, and more physical resilience to cold. You can survive conditions that would kill an older person, but you have less accumulated wisdom, fewer resources, less community trust. Old healers have the opposite trade-off, more knowledge and respect, but failing bodies that cannot maintain temperature as effectively. Medieval life expectancy is short, partly because surviving to old age is so difficult when every winter is a survival challenge. The healers who make it to 60 or 70 are the lucky ones, the ones who manage to stay warm enough, fed enough, healthy enough year after year. Your survival odds also depend on the specific winter you're experiencing. The 14th century had particularly brutal winters as part of the larger climate shift toward the Little Ice Age. Some winters were remembered for generations because they killed unusually large percentages of the population. A healer who would have survived an average winter might not make it through one of these killer seasons regardless of status or preparation. You're not just fighting the cold, you're gambling against weather patterns you can't predict or control. There's a strange kind of equality in the absolute worst conditions. During siege or famine, even wealthy physicians suffer. When the castle's food stores are depleted, when the firewood runs out, when disease spreads through crowded conditions, status matters less. Everyone's cold, everyone's hungry, everyone's vulnerable. But these extreme conditions are temporary for most people most of the time. The normal medieval experience is hierarchy all the way down, including in how well you sleep. And now, as morning fully breaks over the castle, and you step into your role as healer for another day, let's ease ourselves out of this cold journey together. You've spent these hours with me, in a world where survival demanded constant vigilance, where comfort was measured in degrees above freezing rather than actual warmth, where every night was a careful negotiation between the cold and your stubborn human biology. The healers of medieval Europe, physicians, herbalists, wise women, monks, and nuns in infirmaries, they weren't just fighting disease. They were fighting the cold itself every single night, armed with nothing but wool prayers, folk wisdom, and whatever scientific knowledge their era could provide. They wrapped themselves in layers, shared warmth with dogs and apprentices, pre-warmed their beds with heated stones, and still woke up cold more often than not. But they survived. Generation after generation of them survived, refined their techniques, passed their knowledge forward, and eventually their descendants, us, inherited a world where indoor heating is so reliable that we barely think about it. We've forgotten how much of human ingenuity was devoted simply to not freezing to death while sleeping. We've forgotten that for most of history going to bed was an act of faith that you'd wake up again. The medieval healer's night gives us perspective if we let it. Every time you adjust your thermostat, pull up a light blanket, or complain about your bedroom being slightly chilly, remember someone once survived with straw mattresses and wool, with shared body heat, and desperate prayers with knowledge that any night might be their last. They did this not once, but hundreds of times every winter of their lives, and they got up each morning and did their work, treated their patients, and prepared to do it all again. So tonight, wherever you are, whatever your own struggles might be, maybe you'll pull your blankets a little tighter and feel grateful for the warmth that comes so easily to you. Maybe you'll think of those healers wrapped in their wool and faith-breathing clouds of frost in their own bedrooms, and maybe you'll sleep a little better knowing that human resilience has always been extraordinary. We're the descendants of people who survived impossible things, and that strength lives in us still. Rest well, friends. Stay warm. And remember, that morning always comes even after the longest, coldest night. The story ends here. See you in the next video. Good night.